Joe Biden has concluded his first trip abroad as US president. In an exhausting schedule, he met with friends and he met with foes. In intensive talks with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, in Geneva, Biden cast himself as an advocate of liberal, values-based democracy. He also highlighted what he sees as the military and economic threat posed by Russia and, above all, China. So on to the point, we ask, Biden warns Russia and China, but is Europe on board? Well, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the show, where my guests here in the studio are Liana Fix, a Russia expert from the Kerber Foundation, who says the Biden-Putin summit is not only about confrontation, it is also an opportunity for more stability between Washington and Moscow. Also with us is Matthew Karnichnik, Chief Europe Correspondent for Politico. His opinion, if the EU fails to achieve a common approach to Russia and China with the US, the West is doomed. And a warm welcome too to Suji van Brunnesum from DW's Asia desk, who argues that the US, China and Russia have more in common with each other, and Europe should not take sides. Interesting comments, all three. Thanks very much. Thank you very much, too, for being here. And I'm going to begin with you, Matthew. It's been a very intense week of diplomacy for Joe Biden in Europe. Are we in a better place now than we were before all the talking began?
I think so. I think he made clear that the United States remains very dedicated to Europe and wants to keep the alliance intact and is hoping that the Europeans will join him in confronting both Russia and China in the years ahead. And there seems to be at least an openness to these ideas. In terms of the atmosphere with Russia, I think he also succeeded in calming the waters a bit. I don't think the two of them,
they're not buddies.
They're not going to be best buddies. They didn't look into one another's eyes and see their souls. They shook hands and had a fairly cordial but frank meeting, I would say.
They smiled.
And they smiled, which with Putin isn't that easy, I think.
Liana, you talked about it being the meeting in prospect beforehand. You said it should be about cooperation and not just confrontation. Now everybody is talking about the US and Russia entering what is called strategic stability dialogue. I gather this is very important for the insiders. I think it's very important that you explained it for us, because it's right in the middle of what we're doing here, what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly why the summit was a success, because the US and Russia decided to focus on those areas where there are most dangers and most risks. And the area of nuclear weapons and limiting nuclear weapons, the last treaty, the New START treaty, was just prolonged last minute when Biden came into office. Yeah. That's on the agenda, and that is meant by strategic stability, limiting nuclear weapons, addressing new threats like cyber threats, and new weapon systems that are developed right now. This is one of the most dangerous areas in the US-Russia relationship for all of us. And that is why it is so important that there was agreement. They repeated the Reagan-Gorbachev statement: a nuclear war should not be fought and cannot be won. That's a very important sign for both sides. It's not the most juicy or most sexy topic, but it is an incredibly important topic for the security of basically everyone on this world.
Mm-hmm. And Suji, just coming back to the mood, President Biden is sometimes seen as a bit of a sort of a soft-spoken diplomat, but he can, he can be more confrontational. How do you see him?
I see Biden as a very experienced politician. He has decades of experience as a politician, first as president, then as vice, as well as in local politics. And he's very careful and calculated and cautious. Everything he says largely, it's scripted, it's edited. Mm-hmm. And he's a huge contrast to Donald Trump, his predecessor. Mm. And I think that because Trump alienated a lot of the international community with his characteristics being very loud, outspoken. I think Biden has a lot of appeal, actually, as a politician in many countries outside of the US, for example, in Asia. The way he kind of presents himself, with a lot of East Asian cultures, it's very... it gives more respect, and I think people also need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, and he's very much made the power struggle between the US and China his central, or one of the central focuses of his foreign policy. What do you make of that?
I think that Biden has been very, very clever. It was a very smart move. I think we can all agree that communicating with Putin, and even though you said it wasn't the most juicy, sexy kind of move, I think it is a huge move forward in progress to kind of buddy up with Russia for the first time in a long time, because we all know the elephant in the room is China. Biden is mostly concerned about China than he is about Russia at the moment. And Russia is traditionally China's ally. And so to kind of now be more open to cooperation, just to attend the summit, I think he has put the whole of Beijing kind of at edge, and everyone's nervous in China, yes.
You don't look as though you buy all of that, Matthew.
Well, I think that Putin is actually under a lot of pressure when it comes to China. It's worth remembering that Russia is a fairly small economy. It's about as big as the economy of Spain. They have a lot of nuclear weapons, which makes them very dangerous. But I don't think that anybody really thought that Putin wanted to start a nuclear war with the West, or even this kind of arms race like we saw in the Cold War, because that's also very expensive, although there have been some worries in the United States that the Russians are developing new hypersonic weapons that would threaten the West. Be that as it may, I think the real issue is China. I think the problem that Putin has, though, with China is that he doesn't want to be too dependent on China. So the degree to which he can calm things with the West, probably the better also in his view.
To be a little bit pessimistic, I think we have to admit that we are already in an arms race, because both Russia and the United States are modernizing their nuclear arsenals and are developing these weapon systems, which is just to say that the focus of this summit was so important because we are already at a stage in this area where everyone is in danger if some weapon systems are further developed. And that's also why cyber was such an important element of the summit. Biden gave Putin a list of 16 critical infrastructure areas that should not be targeted by cyber attacks. Again, sounds very technical, but it's incredibly important to our daily life.
I guess the problem, and the reason I wouldn't sleep so soundly, is that the Chinese are also developing these weapons, and they are not party to these arms control agreements that date back to the Cold War.
And should be brought in the future, most definitely, yeah.
OK, well, let's just listen to get a flavour of the two presidents as they spoke in Geneva. Let's listen to, first of all, Joe Biden, and then we'll hear what President Putin had to say.
And if, in fact, they violate these basic norms, we will respond. Cyber. He knows. In the cyber way. Number two. I think that the last thing he wants now is a Cold War.
Well, for his part, Vladimir Putin said, generally, we understand what our American partners are talking about, and they understand what we mean when we refer to red lines. But, he added, the two sides had largely avoided touching on divisive issues. Liana, what are the red lines that emerged from the talks? They were much talked about in advance. Can you pin them down? It's a short list.
Election meddling, a huge red line for the United States. Yeah. Cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, as I just mentioned, big red line. Obviously, human rights are also a very important topic, and Biden brought up the case of Navalny. But there it is difficult to set a red line, because how can you react if someone crosses this red
Joe
line
Biden
in
did
his
set a red
domestic
line.
policies?
He made a very clear statement of
Exactly,
intent.
that it would be very, very problematic if Navalny dies in prison. But again, what is the reaction that you can take to this action? So what they focused on were areas where they really could make progress, and the other areas were discussed, but the focus now is on certain areas and to see whether positive developments take place there, and from then we can take it to other areas possibly.
And Suji, how important do you think it is that there is a growing clash between the political cultures of the Western model, as it were, and then the Eastern model of, illiberal democracy?
I think that, for example, opponents of Eurocentrism and imperialism would say that it wouldn't be so much as a clash of political systems and cultures, because China has always been, for example, a communist state since 1949. And I think that all three of these economies, both Russia, the US and China, have huge human rights violations. And they have very different political systems, but all three are struggling with serving social justice back home. And I think that, the main issue is actually the competition between competing economies by three countries that are led, by three men that have, frankly, a lot of hubris, arrogance, a bit of ego, if I may say. And, they all want to be at the top of the world, all three of them. And we are framing this as a kind of a clash of values of the world, that's kind of dividing everyone between East and West, between, Europe and the US and Asia. But in fact, I think people should pay a little bit more attention that what we're actually seeing is a competition between three very greedy countries, all three of them. And all three countries have huge human rights abuses and social injustices.
Well, many ordinary Americans might be asking themselves who the big enemy is these days. For President Biden, there is no doubt that the greatest long-term strategic challenge to America is China.
A group photo with friends. The U.S. will desperately need them in the future. Now, the nation's primary rival is China, a powerful opponent. The NATO summit sent out the message to the world that the ranks are tightly closed. Before the summit, the Pentagon had already ordered U.S. troops to shift their focus to China. Some of the measures will likely evoke the ire of Chinese President Xi Jinping, like the planned trade agreement with Taiwan, for example. And a new multi-trillion-dollar infrastructure plan is meant to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative. Beyond that, massive investments in technology are meant to encourage greater independence from Chinese high-tech products. Biden also signed an executive order banning Americans from investing in 59 Chinese companies. But not all of the U.S.'s partners agree with this hardline approach.
China is a rival on many issues, and at the same time, China is also a partner on many issues.
Can President Biden rely on his allies in the confrontation with China?
Well, we'll address that question in just a minute, but I'd like to go back to Suji. And just a few days ago, there was a headline in The Atlantic magazine that caught my eye. Joe Biden worries that China might win. Is he right to worry, and what would it mean for China to win?
I think what Biden means and what the US is seeking is they're worried about China's global influence and Chinese expansion. And they're worried about Chinese companies, overtaking American companies, which have always been very successful. The US has always, in their view, been at the top of world leadership. And I guess they don't want to share that position. And China is now, for the first time, since Xi Jinping came to power, he's kind of transformed China so rapidly because China used to be such a poor, impoverished country, always with human rights violations, always, for decades. China has always had a lot of human rights violations. But the problem is now China's actually become economically very successful, in addition to mass human rights violations. And so my question I always ask is, you know, when China had the Tiananmen massacre, when there was the Great Famine of China, where 45 million people died, and in the Cultural Revolution, when up to 1 million people died, you know, the US, no one in the international community interfered and came to help the people of China. And but China was a poor country. They didn't have any high technology. They didn't have any scientific innovation at the time. People were leaving China, you know, in the millions. We have a huge Chinese diaspora around the world, and no one asked them, why are there so many Chinese people around the world?
I don't think that Biden is as cynical in his approach to China. I think he really has a deep-seated belief that human rights do matter, that this is, and he mentioned at the press conference, that this is a part of US foreign policy. So I think he does not only see it in terms of a great power geopolitical competition with China, but he sees it as a competition of systems, especially since the Chinese system has become more and more autocratic in the last year. So it has taken a backward development to where we've been in the past. And this is something which is not only a power play, but which is something which could be fundamental for his foreign policy, that he places an emphasis on democracy versus autocracy and on challenging China if it becomes even more autocratic.
Matthew.
Well, I would just say I don't think that the United States necessarily is worried about China becoming number one. China is going to become number one. It's going to become the largest economy in the world. That's inevitable, although not on a per capita basis. That may never happen. I think the issue here, I mean, you mentioned all of these historic wrongs that were committed against the Chinese people. I think what the difference now is that China is threatening its neighbors. It's threatening its neighborhood. It's become a threat well beyond China's borders. And I think this is what has worried the United States. I also wouldn't mention the United States and its human rights abuses to the degree that those exist in the same breath as China or Russia. As far as I know, the United States is not operating any concentration camps at the moment, like the one in Xinjiang. I think the U.S. tried to partner with China, and there was a hope in the West that through economic development and through prosperity, China would join the family of democratic nations, that there would be a hunger in the Chinese society for democratic reforms. And that hasn't happened. I mean, it exists clearly in China, but it has been snuffed out. So this is why it has become this rivalry of systems. Mm-hmm. And this is why Biden is concerned, and not just Biden. This is a bipartisan issue in the United States.
So what should Biden do, and what should Biden do together with the Europeans?
He needs to bring the Europeans on side. The United States has tried to do this, I think, with some success by explaining to the Europeans and convincing them of the danger that exists. And we saw this in this debate over 5G network technology that the Chinese company Huawei was very eager to sell in Europe and is eager to sell in Europe. And the United States came and tried to convince the European allies that if they were to take on this technology, that they would be opening themselves to subterfuge going forward by the Chinese. And they've had mixed success on that front. But I think at least this issue of China is taking a much more central position in the European debate than it did even a year ago.
And I think, just to add on this, it's also so difficult to advance this debate in Europe because of the public mood and of the public perception of China, which is only shifting very slowly. So China is still not perceived as a threat in Germany and also in many other European countries. And then we have, in addition, the economic interests, obviously the business interests with China. And this together is something which sort of politicians have to consider when they take a stronger approach to China, to take their population with them and to explain to them why we have to change our China policy.
And can you imagine Xi Jinping going into listening mode with Joe Biden in the way that Vladimir Putin apparently did in the last 24 hours or so?
Well, I mean, it depends on what sort of, if there are any summits planned on this level. I mean, that would be a huge occasion. I think what was good about the Biden-Putin summit is that they established a personal relationship which is not about trust, which is not about any romantic friendship inclinations, but is very much about pragmatic business. What can we get done together? where do we not agree, and let's try to advance in those areas where we can agree.
When you say we, we're often talking about Germany, and the case against Germany in this instance is that Germany wants to sell cars to China. It wants its pipeline with Russia. It's distracted by an upcoming election, and there's very little commitment to making common cause with Joe Biden in terms of defence spending. Where does that leave Germany's?
I wouldn't say there's very little commitment. Germany has raised its defense spending, not to the levels that the United States would see. But the fact is, Germany is an exporting nation and always has been. It is very dependent on export. It has an aging population. It can't easily just say, OK, we're not going to export anything more to China when you have big companies like VW and others that are almost completely dependent on China. And the United States is also economically dependent on China to a degree. So I think this is why it's not useful to look at this through the frame of the Cold War and to say there's going to be another Cold War, because these systems are already very closely intertwined, and the West needs to find a way to deal with China without completely cutting it off, because that's just not possible. China is already many times larger than the Soviet Union ever was in terms of the size of its economy, and it's just growing even more.
And so, what can China reasonably expect from the Europeans in the years to come, and specifically from the Germans after their election in the nearer future?
I think we also have to see what happens with our upcoming elections here in Germany. You know, for example, with the Greens upcoming, and Germany and China, they have to cooperate, and everyone in Germany knows that, because climate change is also a huge problem. And everyone knows that climate change cannot be addressed without China in the discussion. And so I think, and also Germany and China has very strong trade relations, and neither one of them benefits from, any kind of political dispute. So I think both countries need to really take into account, social issues such as climate change and trade and business and all the benefits they get from each other, and kind of find ways to cooperate, just like Putin and Biden did. And China should more get involved with European discussions, get involved with more talks with Europe, so that people can kind of, focus a little bit away from this competition of who's number one superpower. I mean, there shouldn't really be any superpower. We should all find better ways to improve human rights, to improve trade. And China has to be part of that discussion.
So tell me how perceptions in China about issues around sort of liberal values and Western values, what we like to call Western values, how those perceptions are changing, given that there's so much more movement for Chinese people in the global situation.
Okay, I think that, for example, Europe and the US would benefit from understanding Chinese culture more, from understanding the history more, the language. I mean, the reason I think people feel so alienated now in Germany is because we don't actually have much direct contact with China and Chinese people. And so if we did, we would have this understanding that for a lot of Chinese people, especially my mother's generation, for example, China went from complete poverty to this very successful, booming economy. And so I think people have this tendency in China to kind of have this compromise. Okay, maybe we don't have freedom of speech. It's an oppressive state, but we have access to technology. We have this middle class in China now, and Chinese people can study abroad now and travel. Before, a decade ago, China was completely closed. People didn't have these privileges like the people have in Europe and in the US. And suddenly they want a taste of this pie as well, And so I think Chinese people don't want to go backwards in their mindset. And they are, I'm not saying they're happy to kind of go along with things, but, it is a fact that a lot of quality of life for a lot of people has improved. And I think people associate this with Xi Jinping and all his social policies he's made in China.
Liana?
Yeah, I think just to add, I think the problem really is that it seems that the leadership in Beijing is not really interested in making human rights part of any dialogue or of any agenda. And while there is a lot of dialogue going on with China, and you're absolutely right that there are many areas where it should go on, there's very clearly a very strong pushback from Beijing on all issues where the West and Europe criticizes China. And this is something which should not be acceptable to an open dialogue between partners and countries, that some areas are really forcefully tried by Beijing to be cut out of dialogues, to be cut out of negotiations, sanctions against members of the European Parliament who speak out against the human rights situation. And that is something which is so concerning, that dialogue with China, as important as it is, has become so much more difficult in the last years due to an increasingly autocratic development at home. And that is something which is so concerning.
They've also changed their entire approach to diplomacy. China used to have this sort of quiet diplomacy and didn't want to really be noticed too much. That was sort of my feeling in Europe in particular. And now they have these so-called wolf warrior diplomats who go out there just attacking people left and right. So, I mean, that has been really a fundamental change.
OK, thank you very, very much indeed for all those impressions, all those views. Great stuff. I wish we had just a little bit more time. We've been talking about China, Russia, the US, and the moral issues surrounding the diplomacy between those countries. Thanks very much for joining us. And if you've enjoyed the programme as much as I have, come back next week. Bye-bye. Cheers.